So I'm Lindsay Silver. I'm the head of product at CondeNast. I lead all of our editorial, consumer, and advertising products. And in that day job, I do a lot of thinking about data. I'm really excited to be here with Rich and more in discussion than I think in interview. So I'll turn it over to you, but I think it's going to be an interesting talk.
Yeah, I'm Rich Karlgaard. This is my 27th year at Forbes. New York headquartered, of course, but all of my years have been here in Silicon Valley. And I'm a great admirer of CondeNast's family of publications, from Vogue. Well, I guess I admit that I don't read Vogue, although you can't help but follow the career of Anto Wintour. But two publications I read with enthusiasm are Vanity Fair and The New Yorker. And so those are the kind of iconic publications under the CondeNast umbrella. So let's talk about digital transformation at CondeNast, and then in particular, the AI application to what you're doing.
Yeah, so just at a high level, CondeNast is made up of about 18 brands. All of those brands have some global presence, and so we've got a pretty big platform to work under. I would say some of them, obviously, like The New Yorker or Wired or Vogue, are extremely large brands in the media space. Some of them are smaller. We just sold W, but it was one of our smaller brands. All of those, when we're looking at how to transform them from what they were 20 years ago, which were successful magazine companies, into digital platforms, sort of transform a little bit differently. And so when we first look at them from a digital standpoint, and then second look at them from an AI standpoint, we have to find ways to normalize, to think of them in the same way. And the first is to think about the content that they produce. What is the shape of the content? The second is, what is the shape of the revenue model? So as we go digitally, brands like The New Yorker are extremely consumer revenue driven. Brands like Vogue are actually extremely advertiser driven. And so finding those similarities and differences gives us sort of the foothold to start thinking about digital products. And eventually, after that, to think about AI and how we apply data and change to that. So that sort of sets the stage.
Well, when I think about the family of CondeNast publications, they're all different, as you say, but they all have in common that they're cultural trendsetters of one kind or another. Literary trendsetters, fashion trendsetters, in the case of Wired, technology trendsetters. I mean, so there is a theme. I mean, is it important to capture the CondeNast theme or the individuality of the different publications?
Right, yeah. No, it's a good question. And I think actually that gets us right into the data aspects of this. So one of the first things when I started at CondeNast, I was actually conceptualizing Conde's data platform, all of the infrastructure to drive the modern use of ML within CondeNast. And I went to an agency in New York that I won't name, and I said to one of the founders, hey, look, we just built this first generation of this thing. We can actually give you a lot of data about how audiences look at content. And he looked right back at me and he said, look, once it's out there, once your content's out there in the world, it's a commodity. And that goes for Vogue, that goes for Wired, that goes for all of these things. The trend has been set at that point. And what other platforms like Facebook, like Instagram, like these are doing is then picking it up and magnifying, and they're actually capitalizing on it, but also commoditizing that information. What that agency, and since then probably a dozen different clients and customers have said is, look, we want to be able to predict the trends based on your information before they're anywhere else. And you have something that no one else has because you know what's going to be a trend before it actually hits the newsstands or before it hits the digital world. That made me really realize that when you're building a data platform and when you're doing these things, that core data that you have and that access and even just the timing, the dynamics of that data is what makes you different. And so what we've focused on since then, in addition to building sort of frameworks and the underpinnings of a really solid prediction platform so that we can do recommendations and advertising platforms so we can target audiences and things, is actually to focus on what are the things that make us different. And the trends are them. That is it. So if we know that something's coming out in Vogue in a few months, what we want to be able to do is systematize our action to that and capitalize on that before it actually comes out.
Well, that has value in and of itself. For example, we at Forbes, one of our recent iconic lists is our under 30 list, 30 under 30. And we've been able to monetize that in many forms. including conferences around the world. They're kind of structured like South by Southwest conferences. 30 under, the U30 conference in Tel Aviv, in London, in Warsaw, this year in Detroit in the US. But we also learned something that is very intriguing. We haven't acted on it. And that is if you took all of these under 30, the people not from the world of entertainment, but the world from business, and we looked at the value of their companies. At the time, we named them to our U30 list. And then you did a regression analysis based on the data, and you looked at the value of the companies today, you'd have said, why weren't we investing in those companies?
Right.
And so, that's an example how, data may open up new doors to new products that are CondeNast branded. So, but I want to loop back to that and ask you how AI and data may point the way into an expansion of your franchise. But first talk about how it plays out individually for each of your publications.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe I'll start again at sort of that bottom layer. So when we build these things, we, mainly because of cost and because of cultural change, we need to start with that platform. And so we need those pipes first, and we built those at the Condé Nast level. We decided explicitly not to build one set of pipes for the New Yorker and another set for Vanity Fair, because we actually think the learnings, the models that we build and the things that we do actually are similar enough between our brands that we should start there. When it comes to application, the applications are really specific. So one of the first products we released when we built our ML platform was a model that allowed us to auto-link links, and that was specifically for Vanity Fair. So Vanity Fair is very people-focused, it's very celebrity-focused. And so it has a slightly different way of thinking about people than any of our other magazines. And so we recognized that there was a huge value if we could find all of the places in all of the archive going back sort of forever where people were mentioned and pick the best article or best thing to link off to, that we could actually create consumer value in that. And we did some tests. We had some people our editors go back and manually link, and we found a major uptick in the click-through rates and actually the downstream ad revenue. So when we built that product and released it, that was a Vanity Fair specific product. And so we've taken an approach, I think a lot of people have echoed or said this today, we've taken an approach where we started with a customer first problem. We've allowed our product managers, our engineers to have access to the data and the tools to solve those problems. And then we've had them solve them on a specific basis. If they work on a specific basis, then we've tried to generalize them. So we have auto-linking now across all of our brands in some way, shape, or form. Those tools come from that first implementation on Vanity Fair.
Well, if you start with Vanity Fair and the data that you're collecting from Vanity Fair, some percentage of Vanity Fair subscribers will also be Vogue subscribers. Some will be Wired subscribers. Some may be New Yorker subscribers. Have you gained insight on that to be able to predict which among your Vanity Fair subscribers might be, might also become subscribers to these other magazines?
Yeah, and actually one of the things we're really focused on now, and we found a niche in, is propensity. So you learn a lot from somebody by the content they read, by what they subscribe to, and their behaviors are very different, both from those propensities for specific, we would call them sort of neighbor-aligned brands, but also their propensities to act in certain ways. So there are some people that just will subscribe to things. They are more likely in general to subscribe, and we may actually try to promote subscriptions across our network. You may not be a Vogue subscriber, you may not have even ever read Vogue before, but you're someone that may be more interested in subscribing just generally. And so when we look at our models, and maybe I can go kind of technical here for a second, but when we look at how we model these things out, propensities, these actions that users take across our network, we're doing that in a way that allows us to both apply them either on a specific brand level or across our network. And that sounds a little bit more difficult to do than it is. This all comes down to the way you capture the data in the first place. So Condé Nast has three major entities or major types within our business. We have our consumers, the people who read our magazines. We have the content that we produce that they read. And then we have the advertisements that sit alongside that content. And when we model out our data and when we think about building models on top of our data, it's built based on those entities themselves or the relationships between those entities. And you can obviously take and filter that data down to focus on a specific brand or a specific type of user or a specific type of content. But if you can get access to your data in that way, and if you can model it that way, you get a lot of flexibility in terms of how whether you're doing a cross-brand model. We do a lot between Vanity Fair and the New Yorker has a lot of brand resonance, and so we do a lot of marketing across those two. And we've built propensity models that will actually take into account someone's visits to the Vanity Fair in deciding what ads to show them on the New Yorker.
What's the CondeNast philosophy regarding paid content and firewalls and so many articles you can read per month and all of that, number one, and then what does data tell you about that, about how to maybe fine tune at the margins?
Yeah, so I would say we're earlier in this than we would like to be, and we're modeling how we think about these things on the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, who've gone a lot further, I think, in thinking about how to handle paywalls, how to get consumer products out there. Our thinking is basically, and it boils down to something really simple. We want to build the product that's of the most value for the user. And so and value, the reason a paywall works, and especially when it's a dynamic paywall, when it switches, it's a different number of articles for you than me, and it's optimized around your previous behavior. The reason those work is because that allows a user and a publisher to quantify the actual value to a user of that content, right? So when someone hits a hard paywall on the Wall Street Journal, they either do or they don't pay the amount of money that it costs to get across that paywall. If they take 3 articles and they feel like, okay, I'm starting to get hooked, the value of that product has gone up, and what their hope is that it lands there. We've started doing a lot more work on dynamic paywalls because we believe that our content is good enough that as you read it, it becomes more and more valuable to you, that it's sticky. While I would say this is an area, we have the technology to do it. We actually have a data science team working specifically on doing this modeling. We haven't released anything yet that I would say is very advanced in terms of the paywalls and sort of in terms of our consumer products. We're still working on sort of how do you take these models, which actually work in a general sense in sort of the 21st century sense really well. How do you take those and work within a culture that is a 100-year-old culture? And how do you explain what a dynamic paywall is to an editor who's used to basically having their content out there? Those things are tricky. The dynamics, the change management you have to do is as hard as the technical pieces.
Well, I'll tell you, we did it at Forbes because we're 102 years old ourselves, is that we almost died.
Yeah.
Had we not raised $250 million in private equity from a local PE firm, Elevation Partners, that's Roger McNamee's firm, got a lot of attention when the firm was started because Bono was one of the partners. And had we not raised $250 million from Elevation, then when the poop hit the fan in 2009, 2010, were you CondeNast then?
I was before my time. I was in the tech industry, but
whole categories of advertisers that support Forbes and support CondeNast, luxury goods. There's a fair amount of overlap between your ad base and our ad base. They went away. They just went away for 3 months or 6 months, however long it was. And so had we not raised that amount of private equity, we would have run out of cash. Yep. And the fact that we had that money, we were able to survive. But it was a glimpse into the existential abyss. And we went completely the other way and decided to open up the platform. We now have 2,000 contributors, and we have it's all free. So we went for volume, and whether there's a right decision or wrong decision, sometimes you don't know until decades pass and you can analyze it. But we're alive and thriving again today.
Well, I think that's a huge thing. I mean, this has gone a little bit off of the specifics of AI, but I think one of the biggest points that I can make as somebody, and I think it sounds like, Rich, it's almost identical to what the decisions you had to make. In order to make changes as dramatic as applying AI, sort of general AI, to a business like CondeNast, you really do have to have a catalyst, some sort of change. You either need a major commitment of an investment or a cultural change within the business. You need to almost die. or you need an incredibly good lobby at the very top, right? This is dramatic change to an older company like Condé Nast, and so you need those pieces to be in place to launch it. And a lot of times that can come from the top, or it can start to sort of snowball from within the organization. And what we've tried to do, and we are an interesting company because we're owned by the family that's owned us for 60 or so years, but at the same time, they're pretty forward-thinking. They made a huge investment in Reddit about 10 years ago, which has been an incredible investment for them. They're now making big investments in tech. So we sit in this place where we're good. We can actually make the case for that investment. But you have to do that change. It's dramatic. It's cataclysmic change. It's not iterative change for a company like Condé Nast.
Well, are you that evangelist within Condé Nast then?
So I've played an extremely big part in that. We formed a data organization about 4 years ago that we explicitly said had a mandate that had never before existed at Condé Nast as a corporation. We had to do that. We went for some wins, and I'll tell you, if you want a roadmap for doing that, we followed a pretty standard roadmap. I think actually we're looking closely at Airbnb, frankly, when we looked at it. For building out the infrastructure, getting the tools into people's hands on one hand, and then doing the change management on another. And analytics is obviously an amazing inlet. So getting people to use data that they've never used before will be extremely sticky in an organization. If you can answer a question for a salesperson or for an editor in our case that they could never answer before, that's really sticky. But you have to start that change somewhere, and while I wouldn't say that I'm...
So you have to have a 4-year plan, but it has to be staged so that you get the early wins and the early buy-in, so the ripple effect from below really works.
You definitely, and on top of that, you really have to expect at some point. We've gone out for large investments since then, because these things, they do take money, and I think several people today said, hey, look, you can't do this unless you have the resources, unless you have the data engineers, the product managers who are sort of know AI. I would say you can do it without those people, but it's extremely, extremely hard. And my teams will tell you, as when we created the technology, that was actually the easy part. The much harder part was then to infuse that technology, to get that data, to get those models used in everyday processes that had never thought to use them before. You need to persuade editors. You need to persuade the business users, our sales teams. You need to persuade people that these are actually more useful and that they're not hurting them or taking jobs away.
I can see persuading salespeople, anything that gives them an edge. But editors are editors. I mean, they're cantankerous. There's a certain profile of people who become editors, and that's the way they are. And particularly it's such a rich culture institution as all the Condé Nast publications, where you can look back at the history of Vanity Fair. You can say, well, this is the Tina Brown era, and then this is the Graydon Carter era. You can look back at the New Yorker with its rich history of editors, and I think they feel a part of that chain of great editors, and so, and all of whom had these golden guts, these gut instincts that became legendary around the publication. So how do you let the editors be the editors while opening the door to the advantages of AI insights from deep data?
Yeah, no, it's extremely hard. I mean, what we realized, and we realized this the hard way, you definitely can't go into an editor and say, hey, look, I can create an AI that will curate your homepage better than you will. You never want to do that.
Somebody laughs in recognition.
You might be able to. Their first answer is going to be, yeah, but then you'll just be creating Google, and that's antithetical to what we are.
Because Google's a commodity.
Exactly.
I mean, Google's a wonderful company, but none of us can match the volume, so we can't live at the commodity level.
Exactly. And to be honest with you all, one of the first things I had to personally come to terms with when I started working, I switched from the technology world, which is very open to this type of change, and also is starting from scratch almost every time. Doesn't have this baggage, or in our case, this incredible rich history of brands to figure out. When I came to terms with the idea that, okay, actually that kernel that is, let's say, David Remnick's sort of gut, or Graydon's got. When I sort of figured that piece out, it actually allowed me and allowed our teams, I think, to start talking that language. So one of the interesting things we did early on when we were sort of trying to figure out how to talk about this and work inside of CondeNast was we took, no one, or maybe someone will be, there's a copywriter and a copy editor at CondeNast named Mary Norris, who has been at The New Yorker for about 30 years.
This is a great story.
And Mary, if you go to The New Yorker and you ask anyone on the floor who has the most impact, who has had in the last 3 years, a lot of people will say David Remnick and before him Tina and those folks. Almost an equal number or maybe more will say that Mary has done it. And literally because she can take an article written by basically anyone from Hunter S. Thompson to Malcolm Gladwell and make it read like a New Yorker article by changing words, by putting punctuation in the right places, by changing it.
Well, I think you're pushing it with Hunter Thompson.
Well, I don't know. I actually wonder if she edited it. It might have been tough on his, but she can take an amazing variety of work and actually get it to feel like The New Yorker. And so one of the things we did early on that I thought was really interesting is we fed all of the articles that Mary had created into an entity extraction and then a keyword extraction system. And then we took all of the punctuation. We actually did a bunch of work to build a custom model that tried to basically figure out if you took another article and put it into the system, how to change the article so that it felt like one of Mary's articles. It failed miserably. We had a PhD data scientist working with a team from Google to do this. It just didn't even come close. In fact, what it would do is it would switch out stop words like is and the for adjectives and weird things like that. And so you get something that didn't even come close. But what we were able to do with that was more important than actually create the model was start having a dialogue with our editors in the terms that they understood. Hey, look, we don't want to replace your job. In fact, we don't even want to replace Mary's job. What we want to do is figure out what are these processes that will basically give you your Iron Man suit. What are these processes that you don't want to do that take up a lot of your time that we can get out of the way for you so that you can actually go into doing more of what is really valuable that you do. And since then, we've done a lot. One of the things that we released that's been a huge success at Condé Nast, maybe more from sort of a compliance standpoint than anything else, is a set of models that take every image that goes into our system that's loaded into our CMS and label it with alt tags and all of the proper ADA compliant text. And what we've done is we've actually validated that with real readers. So we don't want to put text in there that is just a list of keywords or something that doesn't make any sense to anybody. We want that to have as much impact on their reading experience as if you were to see the image itself. And the system now is in its, I think, 3rd or 4th month of active use, and it's working. It's really cool to see it working.
Well, I'm interested in your background because you've spent quite a bit of time in Silicon Valley. So coming into Condé Nast, you came straight from Silicon Valley, correct?
Yep.
In technology. So you're steeped into the Silicon Valley way of thinking, and then you go to Condé Nast in New York, and you're dealing editors who are, every editor of every Condé publication, it feels like they've got carrying a torch, and a glorious torch. How long did it take you to kind of win their trust so that when you came in and said, we're not trying to replace you, a lot of people hear that and they conclude the very opposite, right?
Yep.
I mean, and for some good reason. But you knew, I think, as a privately owned company, Condé Nast would allow you a little more room to get this right. Still owned by the same company that's owned it for 60 years, acutely aware of the legacy. Yep. I mean, how did you go about that? Because so much of these digital transformation efforts turn out to be as much about culture as about technology. So how did you get into the Condé Nast culture so that you could be a more persuasive digital data and AI evangelist?
Yeah, I mean, that was the trick. I think that the reason or the value I can bring to the conversation is how to do that. And I think I was in technology. I was in the startup world for a long time. I founded 2 of my own companies. I worked in extremely smart environments from a technical standpoint. You're right that we didn't have that change management piece, but what we did have is we did have customers. And what I'd sort of gotten 50% to, which I've gotten now, I think I'm probably pretty good at, is figuring out how to listen before I talk about technical problems, and listen before I talk about even product solutions. So our editors actually have an extremely deep understanding of their customers, their readers. And that understanding is nuanced, and it's subtle, and it's extremely important to what CondeNast is. And so my job as a technologist and as the head of our data teams over the years has been to figure out how to actually capture and systematize that. It hasn't been to change that. And it took me a little while to realize that. I mean, this didn't come on day one, but it definitely was the thing that allowed me to do it. So when I talk to an editor now, I don't say, hey, we could do it this other way. Hey, we could, I can do it better than you can because I've got technology. What I say is, hey, you're doing an incredible thing here. How do we make it better? What can I do? And a lot of times I had coffee with David Remnick the other day, and we were talking about the New Yorker's digital products. And David's all in for AI, and he's all in for these things, but he understands what I've come to understand, which is that those things are the only differentiator, the only reason that we stay in business, that we're sustainable, is the kernel that makes the New Yorker the New Yorker. It's the Anna or the David, and that's true. And it took a while for me to come to that, but I did. And I recognize and I recommend to anyone who's in a business that's running to try to really get to the bottom of what the essence of the business is, and then to start thinking about what of those
build
nuances.
Build an Iron Man suit, as you put it.
Build the Iron Man suit. Yeah, we do that to this day. In media, the easiest way to do that in this current world is actually within the sales force. If you can give products, we create audience targeting and contextual targeting products that have added a lot of revenue to our business. And when I can come into an editor of a brand that's struggling and say, hey, look, we added $10 million of revenue to you last year, and by the way, it didn't affect your editorial experience at all, that gets me in the door. I mean, that starts the discussion, definitely.
I'd mentioned earlier in our conversation about, does data inform you about adjacent spaces that you could go into that aren't traditionally editorial or are adjacent to editorial, but might be new forms of revenue that might not have occurred if you hadn't put all the data together and with AI gotten some really interesting inferences?
They do. I'm trying to think about how to answer that diplomatically, because one of the other things that happened when I came from Silicon Valley, and if you work in a startup, you know this, you feel hedged in by your sort of lack. A startup company, a company in its earlier stages, a lot of companies, are very single-minded, and they have to be, and success is driven by focus. What you can do with data at Condé Nast is you can take a look at our, between 250 million and 350 million monthly active users, and you can see patterns in what they do, and you can actually derive probably 1,000 new business opportunities and 1,000 adjacencies. If we just, in fact, now that we just globalized the company, so now it is exponentially more. If we put this event in this market, based on the engagement with this topic, we'll probably make this much more money. And being able to sift through and being able to say, okay, this is great, but what is the greatest, is still something. I mean, it's the flip side. It's the other edge of data, which is that data can sometimes give you signals that aren't what aren't right. You have to be able to sift through, and you have to understand it. And I think that's something that I heard several times today. Data isn't giving you the answer. It's giving you a tool to look at the answers, at prospective answers. And so we have definitely made investments. I would say some of the automated ways that we've handled this, we built a system that does almost all of our first round curation of all of our social posts now. So it's pushing social media, almost all of our social media posts, it's deciding first, and then editors are making decisions about whether those are quite right. Those kinds of systems are powerful, but they definitely don't give you the answer by themselves. And from a business standpoint, I would say the same. What they do, and I think especially when you have a repeatable business like Condé Nast, if we have Vogue now in 20 markets, we may actually go to 40 markets in the next few years. What they do is allow you to really quickly see things that you couldn't see about those spaces. So we can run predictive models and figure out what would happen if we had a Vogue in, let's say, West Africa or somewhere like that. Those were things that we couldn't do even 5 years ago. We have to have the hypothesis first, though, on those things. It definitely isn't spitting that out and saying this is what you should do.
Well, we are bang on out of time, and that was really terrific, Lindsay. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Rich. Thanks, everyone.